This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. China has seen a massive, rapid cleanup of its skies over the past decade. By slashing coal use and upgrading power plants, the country has cleared the smog that once defined many of its cities, significantly improving public health. But lately, a startling counter-narrative has emerged in the headlines. An article in The Economist argued that China's air quality improvements have hastened global warming. Meanwhile, research cited by Australia's ABC News suggests the cleanup may even be driving hotter and drier conditions in Australia. But how could cleaning up pollution possibly make the planet warmer? Well, this has everything to do with aerosols, the tiny particles in the atmosphere that play a complex role in reflecting sunlight and forming clouds. In this episode, we take a step back from the headlines to ask, what is the science actually saying? Can we really blame clean air for a warming world, or are news headlines oversimplifying a much more complex climate story? Joining us now is Arvea Marieni, European Climate Pact Ambassador. Arvea, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, usually we assumed that cleaning up pollution should always cool the planet, but some recent reports say that China's success in cleaning up air pollution may have accelerated global warming. From a scientific perspective, why does this argument exist at all, and what are researchers actually observing?
First of all, I think it is important to say that science, unlike what some claim, is actually clear and very set. And it's been set for decades. And what I'm going to say today actually takes from the words of US astrophysicist Carl Sagan during his 1985 testimony before US Congress. 1985. That means that we already basically knew everything and we haven't acted. And there has been a lot of inaction and manipulation in communication. But let's go to the fact. It is true that aerosols and some pollution and particles, in particular sulfate aerosols, actually do have a localized cooling effect. And this is dependent on a simple mechanism that determines Earth's surface temperature. This is determined by the balance of energy. And what sort of energy? This is incoming sunlight. The sun emits energy reaching the Earth. And then this energy is in part absorbed by the planet and in part is reflected back. And this is called the albedo effect. And what happens is that there is a balance with incoming energy equaling outgoing energy. And this is the equilibrium of the temperature. In the atmosphere, we do have some greenhouse gases. Those are CO2, methane, water vapor, and others we may refer later that are regulated by the Kyoto Protocol that actually absorb some of the outgoing energy, which is emitted by the planet in form of heat as infrared radiation. And then there is aerosols that can partially offset this warming by increasing the albedo and scattering sunlight, but only, as I said, in a temporary manner, because these are short-lived. The greenhouse gases are actually very long-lasting in the atmospheres. Therefore, 90% of the climate changing effect is determined by greenhouse gas emissions. And we do actually have to tackle this issue, the main cause, without trying to take this relatively limited effect that is also something that we cannot consider as a negative thing, because pollutants and aerosols, they may help localized cooling for a short period of time, but they're extremely dangerous in terms of health impacts. There are about 4 million to 5 million unnecessary deaths due to air pollution based on analysis of the World Health Organization, and also environmental impacts.
You mentioned these aerosols. What exactly are aerosols? Can you explain a little bit to our listeners who may not be familiar with climate science? Like, how are they different from greenhouse gases like CO2?
Oh, those are tiny solid or liquid particles that are suspended in the air. sulfate, or soot, black carbon. Think about what is emitted, for instance, from container ships or ships that are navigating our oceans. The key difference is that, as I mentioned, these aerosols, these particulates, are short-lived and they can actually be gone in weeks. And they cool or warm locally while CO2 persists for centuries and drives this long-term changing effect. In practice, we could say that these tiny particles offset, as I mentioned, a bit the effect of the greenhouse gases, and they are like the planet, to make it as a metaphor, wearing sunglasses. It's like we were looking with sunglasses, and suddenly we had taken off the sunglasses, and we immediately felt the temperature that had been accumulating over the past decades, but they are not creating this increase in temperature.
Okay, so you said these aerosols, they are short-lived, but I think since the industrial age began, perhaps these aerosols have been there for maybe decades. So does that mean humanity may have been underestimating how hot the planet already is?
Well, the effect of these aerosols is roughly a set considered by science, by scientific consensus, between zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.5 Celsius since 2000. And this is exactly reflecting what earlier climate models were predicting. And this is exactly what Carl Sagan, the US astrophysicist, was anticipating in front of Congress in 1985. And he was making the point that trying to offset temperature change due to the fundamental issue of emitting fossil fuels would have been a crazy thing to do, a pointless thing to do, because you need to challenge and change the root cause and treat the root cause, not the variations or the marginal other elements.
Yeah, so when researchers say that reducing aerosols has unmasked warming, they are not saying new warming was created, but the warming that already existed has become visible. Is that a fair way to understand it?
Absolutely. The word unmasking is actually consensus in literature. And as I was saying before, it is the metaphor of the sunglasses, or when you got a stove and there is a ventilator and a flow of air on the top of the stove. You are there, you're cooking. You do not really feel all the heat there is there because there is this effect of the ventilator. But in the moment in which you switch off the ventilator, the heat is felt and perceived immediately. This is exactly the same thing that happens with these aerosols.
So is this just a localized effect, or actually it may have some global impact? Because we recently saw some reports say that China's cleaning up pollution action has somehow led to warmer temperatures in Australia. I mean, are there any, like, how strong is the evidence for these arguments?
All major climate models show the aerosols, those tiny particles from coal industry or transport, have masked roughly this level of zero point 0.5, I mean, average centigrade of warming. But those effects are fundamentally localized and they are short-lived. In the moment in which pollution ends, also the effect ends in matters really of a very short period of time. And we've seen this effect, we've observed this effect in certain geographies, such as Southeast Asia. It's not only a matter for China. China, obviously, it matters because of the significance and scale and the accelerated pace at which this depollution process has been carried out in just a matter of basically a few years. But there is no essential effect that really can impact structurally, according to science, the variations of climate change and temperature at global scale.
Okay, so as you said, sulfur dioxide can create a short-term cooling effect, but there might be some broader harms for our human health, ecosystems, and rainfall patterns even. So can you explain that a little bit? And does relying on dirty air for temporary cooling create more serious long-term consequences?
Absolutely. I would like to consider, and we really have to consider that climate policy, climate management, let's put it this way, is not only about mitigation, that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is the fundamental and first step, but we need to work in harmony with the functional rules of the ecosystem, so the planetary ecosystems. Why? Because the planet is not only reflecting heat, but it's also absorbing this sunlight, this energy. And a lot of this energy is absorbed by oceans and, for instance, forests. Those are the regulating ecosystem services that the planet provides. And what we are doing is affecting all these planetary boundaries that are scientifically determined and quantified as thresholds, above which ecosystems lose their balance and accelerate tipping points and accelerate feedback mechanisms that are even not completely understood. And we are seeing an acceleration not only on the climate systems, but also on the overall health of the functioning ecosystems of the planet. Think of the consequences on, for instance, of water availability that is connected to the green water cycles regulated, for instance, by forest coverage. Going back to the aerosols, you mentioned that there are immediate effects. Those can be quantified in these 4 to 5 million premature deaths per year assessed by the World Health Organization due to air pollution causing respiratory diseases or strokes, etc. There are effects on ecosystems and crops. Because aerosols reduce the amount of sunlight reaching surface by, let's say, a sort of solar dimming, and that can have effect on crop growth. Some studies have shown that particulate pollution can reduce rice and wheat yields. I mean, obviously those percentages are not precise, but on average between 5 to 10% in Southeast Asia. And this obviously threatens food security. There is a huge and fundamental effect that is connected to ocean fertilization and the increase of dead zones, nitrogen oxides and aerosols that are deposited from the atmosphere can over-fertilize coastal waters. And we were mentioning that healthy oceans are fundamental regulators of the planet's climate because of the capture capability of the oceans. And we are coming to a point whereby we're approaching fundamental thresholds for continuing to allow the planet to self-regulate. There is also acid rain with sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and this lowers the soil pH. And obviously, it decreases the nutrients, or there is the damage to forests. And obviously, the all land usage is affected, including agriculture. But those are well-known effects, and we really need to start thinking in systems, not in silos, approaching problems like they were disconnected from each other.
Okay, yes. But I'm thinking in an ideal world, would countries have reduced air pollution and CO2 emissions at the same time? Because I think in reality, governments often have to prioritize urgent air pollution control, especially smog, before they ramp up efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, is that a common historical sequence, and why has it happened this way?
It has happened this way because humans react first to what they see. And obviously, levels of pollutions are immediately perceived, and they do have also shorter term impacts. And because they can be understood at the scale of a few decades, and this is the scale of human life in general. And the same thing that has happened in Asia or in China in particular has actually happened earlier in the West, and especially in Europe, with clean air legislation and actions to modify the energy power generation, switching, for instance, from coal. I'm thinking of Italy that started phasing out coal. And by the way, the process is not yet complete. Not even in European countries, because we realized the negative impacts and the way it was affecting the quality of life. The reason why this has been so evident in China, as I mentioned earlier, is because it was very decisive, because it was extremely rapid action. It is actually impressive the scale and space and the speed at which China has managed to improve quality of air measurably and to a fairly stunning effect, to a fairly stunning degree in a matter of a few years. And then there is the simple gigantic dimension of everything, that the scale of the impacts that are connected to population, to the size of the population and the size of the manufacturing capability of China. Obviously, it would be ideal to being able to proceed on parallel paths at the same time. The problem is that the fundamental management of such complex systems that need to change the economy, the way we produce, the way we live, and the trade-offs between a certain also economic elements within these social engineering processes does create the need to prioritize certain actions in certain moments, maybe waiting to create the conditions or putting off of a couple of years, of a few years, interventions that need to be there. Then there is also an availability of technology or even social reaction, because undeniably, for instance, for China, the attention of its own people to their quality of life has also been recognized by the regulators and the government in order to comply with the needs of the population. And this is the case also for other forms of pollution, such as water discharges. And this is one of the elements, social consensus and education around what climate change means and what pollution means. The two things go together and they have to be managed together. Sometimes timescales might be different.
Yes, actually, we've seen in recent years that China is also setting ambitious carbon peak or carbon neutrality goals. With the help of modern technology, maybe it has become more possible for developing countries to better synchronize these two efforts together.
Absolutely, the past decades, going back to Sagan, because I really believe that this is important to reaffirm how much we knew everything. During this topical moment at the US Congress, he was already anticipating that the acceleration and the development of China, just for the sheer mass and capacity of the country, would mean a substantial change and have an effect that was predictable and that was to be collectively managed on the Earth's climate or on the Earth ecosystems. And Sagan was saying there back then, China only has one source of energy that is affordable for a developing country, and that is coal. And Sagan was saying, if we let China start producing on our behalf, which was the case because there has been this, let's say, unspoken or unwritten agreement behind the process of globalization, offsetting and transferring production capabilities of goods in China, and also displacing emissions and environmental impacts while our economies were diversifying and moving towards more service-oriented societies, and then importing the goods produced in China into our societies at lower prices than what we would have had. I'm talking about Western countries. Had we continued to produce that sort of goods in our places, basically has created a sort of delocalization of emissions and environmental impacts as well. And the Chinese government progressively recognizing from the very beginning and factoring in this unfortunately devastating and unavoidable consequence of the opening up and development phase started in 78, already was considering the potential implications, but they probably just had no other choice. And Sagan was recognizing at the time in front of the Congress that probably would have been very wise from the United States or from the importers from the developed world at the time to support with different technology transfer at acceptable price the Chinese government, the Chinese state, to choose a pathway which was probably going to be cleaner and better for all the countries on this planet. And actually, this is the real issue about how you manage the global commons, being climate change or being ecosystem services provided by healthy environment. It is a shared responsibility, and it does not depend or is not controllable by only one of the actors. It really has to come and be based on a form of amity and agreement and burden sharing between the states for planning ahead how we find and charter the best course for everyone. The last point about the availability and the affordability of these technologies. Having said that technology is only one part of this solution, is a fundamental part because we need to decarbonize and electrify, but we also need environmental restoration and preservation. The two things, and I want to repeat it, need to be together. But anyway, a large responsibility for a great contribution to the capability of the planet to deal with the technological part of all countries, to deal with the technological part of how to address climate change lies with China, that has invested massively over the last 20 years. There is an inflection year around 2010. There is a large-scale determined industrial policy planning and large investment to accelerate not only the development, but also the deployment of technologies that created the market scale for allowing for increased efficiency of these technologies, starting with solar photovoltaic, battery value chains, wind capability. And this has allowed the rest of the world to start being able to purchase more efficient technologies at much lower price. The International Energy Agency or the International Agency for Renewable Energies assess, for instance, in 10 years, a decrease of 89% on the cost of solar manufacturing. And this is because of China. And this is still happening.
Yes, yes, but sometimes headlines can turn this into a blame story, like China cleaned up its air and made the world hotter, and some people may even hear this research and ask, should we just slow down our pollution control to avoid warming? I mean, do you feel that perhaps the media should be more careful when reporting, like scientific research like this?
This is absolutely the point, and this is absolutely why I'm starting this conversation speaking about Carl Sagan. This is exactly what we have been repeating, and I want to remind everybody that the science was clear already in the 80s, and there was a consensus around the actions that we needed to do, even within the United States. George Bush Sr. campaigned for the presidency, calling and asking for a global carbon tax. This kind of consensus seems unthinkable. And what happens at some point at the end of the 80s is the prevailing messaging and this distorted miscommunication that has been originated by a lot of stakeholders and is representing interests, not only geopolitical interests of states but even industries determined to protect their own interests. And this is coming to the detriment of every nation. And this is really something we should be starting considering. The last point I want to make about science communication, this is a point I was making during a workshop with the European Commission. I was invited by the Joint Research Center of the Commission talking about biodiversity. Science seeks precision. Scientists are correctly very cautious about speaking of particular elements, but the reality is that there is a point where evidence is sufficient, is enough, and should not be used to claim that there is not clarity. We have consolidated knowledge for basically all the issues that we are facing at global scale. And we need to act and differentiate between what science is doing and the sense of science, the meaning of science, and the risk management that depends on decisions made by states and by industries. And I want to close with something positive. We did it once, only once. There is one international treaty that is hailed as the only successful international treaty in environmental issues, and that is the Montreal Protocol, which which phased out progressively and is still operational ozone depleting substances. And this is working. And at some point, we even came up with a Kigali amendment to this very same treaty that even started phasing out other substances that are also very, very dangerous for the climate. So we can make it. It is a collective decision. And a very good friend of mine who's been there in the process as first a director general for the ministry, then as minister from the very beginning in the 90s, remembers in 1986 when in Montreal, states decided to close the deal on the Montreal Protocol. Industry from the day after stopped the litany of, oh, it's not possible, it is costly, because the reality is that it is possible and it must be done.
Okay, some researchers are discussing geoengineering ideas like injecting aerosols into the stratosphere. How is that different from the accidental cooling caused by pollution?
The reality is that we are doing human activities are a sort of geoengineering because they change not only the climate but the environment. Always, Sagan was mentioning the fact that, for instance, overgrazing probably in Egypt during ancient period and the Roman Empire created a situation by which the breadbasket, an agricultural area that was supplying food to the Roman Empire, would become a desert. This has happened in history. This is an effect of our action on the planet. Nowadays, with the technologies and with what we are capable of doing, the effects are so much more extreme and more dangerous that can really put at risk and are putting at risk the livability of the planet and fundamentally the sustainability of life in the form that we have in our climate niche on a longer scale. The problem with geoengineering is that we cannot act on specific silos and single elements because the planet is a living system of ecosystems that are interconnected, that are dependent on feedback loops that we do not fully understand and that fundamentally have a balance that we must preserve. That is the main case for geoengineering, which is in the best case considered some sort of B plan, plan B, but definitely should not be pursued without extremely thoughtful consideration and data.
Okay, so one last question. Does this research change the fundamental direction of climate action, or does it actually reinforce why cutting fossil fuels remains unavoidable and the ultimate solution?
Actually, I would say that the priorities are not only not changed, but they are powerfully reinforced. And I mentioned the planetary boundaries model that shows that the planet is non-interconnected systems. We breached several of those, and the main factor behind climate change, which is one of the most fundamental, is fossil fuels. There is an international consensus consolidated, and the direction, of course, is unavoidable and unchanged. For decades, we've been basically conducting a sort of a massive, uncontrolled planetary experiment by altering the atmosphere's chemistry. And we did it largely not understanding the risks, the trade-offs, and the consequences, or not thinking about it. And I would like to remind myself first and foremost, and maybe also give some input to the public, to the audience, that there is a stark warning against deliberate geoengineering in the history of this planet. Over 2 billion years ago, there has been something that is called the Great Oxidation Event. Basically, the appearance of certain cyanobacteria, bacteria in the ocean. I mean, at the time, the planet was very, very different, and there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. And they were actually bacteria, the only form of life, that were thriving in a non-oxygen rich atmosphere, in an oxygen-deprived atmosphere. At some point, the cyanobacteria appear, they start operating via photosynthesis, and they start thriving in this original ancient ocean. And they started as a byproduct producing oxygen. And oxygen, over a scale of millions of years, enriched the atmosphere, creating an oxidation event. And that basically killed every other form of life on the planet. Now, what we are doing is changing fundamental components of this atmosphere, the atmosphere that allows and supports life as we have it. Oxygen at the time, and maybe pollutants, aerosols, and additional greenhouse gases now. And by doing that, we may trigger cascading and unpredictable changes across the entire Earth's systems. And I do not particularly think this seems like a very smart approach.
Arvea Marieni, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cttn.com with your questions or feedback. And stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.